Hello everyone, and welcome to Art is for Everyone. And it's been a while and I'm really excited to be here. I'm trying to get videos done at least every other week, but it's just been busy. But I'm excited to be here today. And this morning I noticed that the lily of the valley are blooming in my yard. And I picked a bunch and took some to a friend, which was really lovely. It's one of my favorite flowers. And so I thought today we would paint a little sort of botanical portrait of lily of the valley in a moss pot, which I love. So I'm going to go over our supplies really quickly. And again, this is a project that is good for all experience levels. So if you're a brand new beginner, you can join in. If you're someone who's painted lily of the valley many times, hopefully you'll learn a little something new this time too. And I want to remind you that we're not trying to make a photographic sort of copy of this flower, but we're making sort of an impression of these beautiful flowers in a little pot of moss. Okay, so I'm going to start with going over my materials, and I want to start stressing that I want you to use whatever you have. It's becoming more and more important to me that people use what they have. And so whether you have a set of praying watercolor from your children's art supply box, or you have a set of Winsor & Newton professional paints, or if you have a mishmash of all different things, or some beautiful handmade paints, or the beautiful Artists for Everyone watercolor palette, whatever you have is okay, all right? And I'm just going to be using basic colors. So when I talk about colors, I'm going to talk about green or yellow or blue or brown. And whatever green, yellow, blue, or brown you have will be fine. All right? So we'll learn a lot that way, and we'll learn to use what we have, which is really, really important. And I also have, today I'm going to be using a sketchbook. And this sketchbook is filled with hot press paper. So hot press paper is just smoother than cold press paper, which is probably the most common type used. If you only have cold press paper, that is absolutely fine. It's not a problem at all. And I'm going to also spray my paints with a little bit of water so they're nice and receptive when I go to pick them up. And so I've got paper here. Any kind of watercolor paper is fine. I probably wouldn't use rough paper, like really roughly textured paper with big textural marks, because it's just a little bit harder to get the detail that we need on these tiny projects. I also have an HB pencil. Any number 2 pencil is fine as well. Nothing too soft and dark, because that will tend to leave graphite in our paintings, and we don't want that. I have a watercolor brush. This is a number 6 pointed round, and this one was made by Silver Brush Black Velvet. I have many size 6 pointed rounds. This one's lovely. It's half synthetic and half squirrel. I really like these brushes. They're affordable, and they hold up really well, and they have a very nice point. So I've got that one today, but really any like size 6 pointed round would be fine. Even a size 8 or a size 4 would be fine. And I have an eraser in case I need it, which I almost always do. So I also have here a little watercolor flower palette. You could also use a white dinner plate or any kind of surface that you could use to mix your paints if you need it. Right now I'm just going to use it to hold my sketchbook open, and I can always mix a little bit of paint here on my palette. So we're going to start with drawing our moss pot, okay? And I'm going to keep this really simple. I'm going to try to make it dark enough for you to see, but I'm going to start by just drawing a little oval here toward the bottom of my paper. I'm just sort of loosely drawing an oval. And then I'm going to use my pencil to sort of bring down the sides. I want to make just a little shallow bowl. And then I'm going to make the curve, the bottom of the bowl, the same as the curve on the opening of my bowl. Do you see that, how this is curved here, and then this curve here would mimic that. And the reason why we don't want a flat line is because if you look at a bowl sitting on a table, the bottom of it where it touches the table looks round. We know it's flat, right? But actually, the illusion is that it's curved. All right, so I'm just going to emphasize that a little bit. And I don't need to worry so much about the back because we're going to be covering that up with moss. Okay, so there's our little bowl. Now our moss is going to come up rather high, so I can just take my pencil and draw some little frilly lines that kind of go around this way, just so I have an idea of where that moss might go. Okay, and then our lily of the valley, we're going to just paint them on. So we're not going to worry too much about that. We're going to start by painting our bowl and our moss. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to erase the back of my bowl. And I drew it because I want those ovals to be realistic, right? So I'm just going to erase that, and I'm going to lightly erase the other lines of the bowl. Not completely, but I want to make them a little bit lighter. We can see a little bit of pencil line, that's fine, but we never want our pencil line so dark when we're doing watercolor with it that the graphite actually moves into the wash, the loose graphite. Now, I shouldn't say never, because there might be a time where that's part of a technique you're doing, but in general, I like to remove any extra graphite. Okay, so now that my bowl is drawn and I have a little suggestion of moss, I'm going to start mixing some colors. So I want to think about my bowl and what color I want it to be. The moss is going to be greens and yellow greens, right? And so the bowl, I want it to be complementary or something that looks lovely with that. And so if I think about complementary colors on the color wheel to green, red and green are across from each other on the color wheel. So I'm going to make my bowl sort of a terracotta red color. And I'm going to start with that, all right? And so I'm going to put down a little water glaze on my bowl, just covering the area of the bowl with nice clean water. And what this does is it gives our paints a lovely surface to glide on. Now I don't want any big puddles of water, so I'm moving my brush back and forth to make sure I don't have any pooling areas or puddles. And now I've got a nice even glaze there. And I am going to choose a burnt sienna color. So burnt sienna would be like Sienne Brulee in the Artist for Everyone set, but most of us have some kind of burnt sienna in our watercolor sets. So I'm going to take some burnt sienna, get a lot of it on my brush, and I'm just going to drop it in to this water glaze and just sort of let the paint move around. Now, I don't want to just swipe it back and forth. I really am dropping it in, and I'm trying not to go over the edges. And the reason I'm dropping it in instead of just painting it on is that I want this mottled sort of texture. I want it to be uneven. You know, I don't want it to be really smooth. Because this might be terracotta pottery. All right. And then once I get some all over the bowl, I'm going to rinse my brush, dry it off, and roll it to the point. And I'm going to move along the edges and make sure that the paint goes all the way to the edge. With the point of my brush. So I'm just sort of running the tip of my brush around the edges. And then I'm going to take a little bit more paint and I'm going to drop it in again. And I'm going to get all sorts of beautiful blooms and textures. Burnt sienna is a very granulating color. So see, by dropping it in, I'm creating those blooms and textures. They're even stronger. There. All right, so my bowl is now done. And while it's starting to dry, I'm going to mix up some greens for the moss. And I'm going to start with a little bit of yellow. So some kind of bright yellow, any kind of bright yellow, and putting that onto my palette. And then I'm going to mix into it a little bit of green. So you have mimosa yellow and you have viridian green in the Artist for Everyone palette, but any yellow and any green is fine. And I sort of ended up with a yellow green. Okay, so I've got that ready. And then I'm also going to make another yellow green. I'm going to take a little bit more of the yellow and a little more of the green. And I want to gray it out a little bit. So I'm going to add a little bit of my burnt sienna. And now I've got more of an olive green. So I've got kind of this bright yellow green and then an olive green. And then I want to make a really, really dark green. So I'm going to go with a blue, like French ultramarine or blue premier. Even phthalo blue is fine. Just some kind of dark blue. And then I'm going to add some yellow ochre. So it's very, very dark. Even more. I just keep adding blue and green until I get a really nice dark green. And once I've got green, I'm going to add in some of that burnt sienna to this, to the dark green as well. So by using the same colors in all of my mixes, I'm creating color harmony. By adding a little bit of that burnt sienna into these two colors, I'm creating color harmony between these three greens. Okay, so here's the key. This has sat for just a minute. It's still quite wet, all right, but I don't want it to be dry. I want, when I put my mossy green in here, I want it to sort of run into this color a little bit. So I'm going to start with my lightest green, and I'm going to use the tip of my brush, and I'm going to go around the edges. So we're leaving the center part open, but I'm just going around the edges, and I'm making little frilly marks with the tip of my brush. See, I'm just letting the brush sort of dance around and making little frilly marks, sort of like moss. And then as I come in, I'm going to fill that in a little bit more. And I'm going to do the same on this side. So make little frilly marks. Just letting the brush dance around. Let it maybe come down on the side a little bit. And then start filling it in. And I'm going to leave a little bit of this top part open with nothing on it. So keep grabbing that green, and I'm bringing it right down. And then when I get to the burnt sienna area for my pot, I'm just going to run it right up to that edge. And if it goes into the burnt sienna at all, that is fine. I'm going to make a little bit more of that. A little more green, a little more of that bright yellow, and just push some of that green right up to that edge. Because what happens is, if it touches a little bit and starts to move into it, it'll look like a little bit of moss has spilled over. All right, just a tiny bit. We don't need much. All right, and just keep dropping in a little bit more of this yellow green. And taking it up to these edges where we made those nice frilly little edges. All right, so now I have a nice layer of this yellow green. Now I'm going to take my medium green, the second green I made, and I'm just going to start dropping it in here and there. Even a little bit out to the frilly areas. And just sort of randomly drop it in all over my moss. And then I'm going to take my dark green and I'm going to drop some in down toward the bottom, especially. You can just kind of march it around. And then every now and then. So less, mostly yellow green, a little bit of medium green, and just a little tiny bit of the darkest green. And when this dries, it's going to give us a more dimensional effect to the moss, okay? So once that's down, I'm going to take a little bit of salt. Now, salt creates texture and beautiful surprises in our work. And I want to wait until the sheen of the watercolor has just disappeared, okay? So I'm gonna wait just a second. If I look at it, if I tilt this up, you can see that it's still really shiny. And I don't want that, okay? I want it to be so the shine is just starting to disappear. In the meantime, I think I'm gonna take some clear water and just soften this area up here where we're gonna put our lily of the valley. Just a little bit. And I think here, this got a little bit too solid. See how I got a little bit too solid there? So I'm going to put some of those frilly pieces sticking out there. Perfect. All right, I'm going to turn the camera off for just a minute until the sheen goes away, and then we'll drop our salt. Okay, so the sheen is just starting to go away, and so this is kind of a tender moment. If I put it on too soon, it doesn't work. If I wait too late, it doesn't work. So I'm going to take a risk right now. I don't want it to get any drier than this, I don't think. And I'm just going to take some salt. This is just pink Himalayan sea salt that we have for our table. But any kind of salt is fine. I recommend finer for smaller things. And I'm just sprinkling the tiniest bit of salt on the moss. Just a little bit. Okay? Now we have to wait. We have to be patient and let this dry completely before we move on to the next step. So welcome back. My first layer is now completely dry, and you can see some of the salt crystals are still on top. So I just brush them off. I'm supposed to brush them off with a brush though, and you should too. If we have any kind of oils on our fingers and we brush our watercolor, chances are that further layers won't stick very well. So I always try to remember to brush my paintings off with a duster. So now we're going to do the fun part. We're going to mix up some more greens, and we're going to paint the greens of our lily of the valley. So we're going to do the same kind of thing, but this time we're going to make our greens a little bit more green. It's because the lily of the valley has a very just vibrant green leaf. And quite honestly, we can really use just a straight green like Viridian, or this, the Viridian in the Artist for Everyone set, or chromium oxide green, or just sap green, something like that, that is just a nice true green. This one is called Fiddlehead, and it's made by Stoneworks Mill. So that's a nice true green. I can even make another pile with Fiddlehead and maybe add just a touch of blue to it, just to cool it off a little bit. So a touch of your blue Premier or any kind of blue, just to cool it off. So we have just some different variations of green. And then also, Actually, I think that's good. I think we might need a darker one, but we'll do that after with the final touches, because we don't want them to, these are such tiny little areas that we don't want them to all run together. So I'm going to start by using just my straight fiddle head on my brush. And I'm going to be using the tip of my brush, okay? And I'm not going to start all the way down here, but I'm going to start a little bit up, and I'm going to use the tip of my brush, and hopefully, you know, unfortunately I'm left-handed, so some of this might get hidden. But I'm going to start with the tip of my brush and put it down, and then kind of move it along, and then lift it up. All right, so same thing over here. I'm gonna put it down, move, like press it down a little bit, and then lift it up. So I'm just sort of making these kind of long, slender leaves. I'm gonna do one over here. I'm gonna push down and lift up. Some will be thicker, some will be thinner. Maybe add a little bit of a different green, push down, lift up. You see what I'm doing? So once we get a few of them down here, I just want to take some clean water and just sort of soften it into the moss. So I don't have anything too harsh there. So maybe every 3, 4, 5 stems, I'm going to do that. I'm going to soften it in. So I'm just going to paint some more. I can overlap them. Let me see here. Some will be darker, some will be lighter. And you know what? Keep them elegant. Think about graceful lines, all right? And they might overlap each other. Some might be more transparent. Some might be more blue. We can add a little bit more blue to that green. Just try to get a little bit of a variety of green. Some might be really thick. Probably shouldn't have had one that thick right in the middle. I'm just using different greens. Okay, maybe I'll do another thin one here. Let me just do that one more time. So if you are overlapping them, maybe use a darker green where it goes over another green. Okay, and now I've done a few, so I'm just going to soften those down into the moss. Okay, and we'll add some darker bits in there later. All right, I'm going to do a couple more. And maybe do some where you start here, so you know just where you're going. And then bring them down. I'm going to do a couple more like that. I want to really fill this in. That's good. And I'm just, again, softening where they meet. Okay, so once I have a bunch of stems like this, I want to add some sort of brown down here at the bottom, and I'm truly going to use brown. So raw umber, any kind of brown. I'm using a little bit lighter one to start. And then I'm going to find some darker brown. Let's see, I've got some up here. Burnt umber, raw umber, anything like that. Just touch some brown to the base here. And then maybe I'll put some nice dark raw umber. You could also use a little burnt sienna. Just little touches of it here and there. Okay, and then I can still take some of my green and even just push it into that around the edges if I feel like I need to. But that's pretty good. I'm really happy with that. Now, the next thing we need to do is paint the stalks. And so we're going to take our green again, and we're going to add some brown to it. So raw umber, burnt sienna, or burnt umber, just a little bit to sort of get a greeny, olivey brown. And I'm going to make a little, and I want it to be fairly light, so not too dark. I'm putting plenty of water in here. And I'm going to start at the top, and I'm going to make like a little hook. And then I'm going to go down and just let it disappear behind some of the greenery, okay? And then I'm going to paint a little hook this way. All right, so that's where our flower is going to go. So let's do another one. I'll do one maybe right here. So I've got, bring it down. Let it sort of disappear behind something. And then a little hook. All right, I'm gonna do one more, maybe over here. So I've got, bring it down. So it sort of goes behind the leaves. Oop. A little hook. And maybe one over here. So like that, and maybe one more, like right here. I would disappear behind that one. Down into there. And then the little hook can go right here. So I've just got some areas where some flowers can go. And the top of our flowers are going to be just straight green. So I'm going to take a little green, and I'm just going to make this little tiny bell of green at the end of each one of these. So the top of the lily of the valley is always like this little green bell. There. Now the flowers are white. So how do we do that, right? Well, we're going to make gray. And so to make gray, I would just take a little bit of your blue, and a little bit of burnt sienna, until you get sort of a blue-gray. I'm going to test it. Perfect. A little bit more blue. So you want it to be on the bluer side. And then I'm going to use quite a bit of water for that. Just really blend it out. So I've got a pale gray. And I'm going to put 3 little petals. Then take my gray and just touch it. See? Just a tiny bit. So they're not going to look white, but our eyes will read them as white. This is really the best we can do unless we get into some pretty fancy footwork. So just 3 little petals. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. And there's our flowers. Okay, so let's look at our greens and let's make one that's a little bit darker. So I'm going to take my regular green again. And I'm going to add some really dark brown to it. So I get a very, very dark green. And maybe even a little bit of blue. It's about as dark as this is going to get. And then I'm going to go and I'm going to look and see a few places where I could add some depth. So especially over some of the areas of individual leaves, and then sort of kind of wash the green down. So I'm just putting a little bit on the side and then bringing some down and sort of filling in the bottom there. Okay, and then I can rinse my brush and dry it off and just soften if I need to. So we're just adding, see, just adding a little bit of dimension. So this one, for instance, it's darker and it goes behind that one, so it would be a little darker there. Maybe this one. Just every now and then. Add a little bit of dimension, just a tiny bit, especially down here toward the bottom where things meet up. This one could be a little bit darker, I think. Add a little bit more. And then I might even add a tiny bit here and there on these stems, just to make them stand out a little bit more. I'm keeping it simple. I'm using the very tip of my brush. And that made them stand out a little bit more. All right, so maybe this one a little bit darker. Perfect. So now our painting is really done, okay? The painting section. But now we're going to go back and we're going to use a pencil to give it some finishing touches. So I'm going to move my paints over and I might turn my painting a little bit. I'm sure hoping that you all can see. I always try to zoom in. Okay, so most of this is dry except for a little bit right in here. So we'll just avoid that for now. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up here and I'm just going to lightly put pencil marks between the flower petals where they meet. Okay, so it just defines them a little bit. And I could even put a little bit of a point on the bottom of them if my brush didn't do that. So if my flower petals don't seem really defined, I can add a little bit of pencil there. I can also add a little bit of pencil to the stems if I need to, if I want to make them a little bit more distinct. I think those are fine. I don't think I need to add anything more to the leaves. I think they're really good. But what I do want to do is I want to add some little tendrils around the mossy edges. So I'm just making little squiggle marks with my pencil. Very, very lightly. I'm barely touching the paper with my pencil. I'm making really, really light marks. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the inside of the moss, especially in the darker areas where I see some darkness, where we put the darker green. Just fill in some of these really light squiggly marks. And it just gives our moss that little bit of texture, especially if it comes over the bowl. All right, just gives it that little extra touch. And then on my bowl, I'm actually going to put line weight. at the corner, down here where it touches the ground. I need to use my eraser there. There would be a shadow here, so just a little bit of line weight there. Maybe a little bit there, just to give it some weight. Now my pencil kind of went over, so I'm just gonna lightly erase that. Perfect. So the only thing left to do really would be to add a cast shadow, and this is not the kind of project that I would do that. I'm perfectly happy with it without a cast shadow. This might be dry enough here. If you want to add a few little tendrils of pencil up in here where it meets the brown, that's also very effective. I can just lightly put a little bit of darkness at the corners like that, just to give it a little shape. I could also put a little edge at the bottom of my bowl, so I could draw a line on each side, draw a pencil line, and then just sort of fill it in so it looks like in shadow, and it just gives the bowl a little bit of a base. There. And that is all. Isn't it pretty? I just love it. So give this a try. If you have any questions, please ask. Again, use whatever materials you have. That's the most important thing. Use what you have. Find ways to make it work. We basically use yellows, greens, blues, and burnt sienna. That's it. All right, everybody, have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for joining me here. And I have to always say, because it's just such a wonderful thing, we are having such a good time on Patreon, and it's just the best community. It's so supportive. People share their work, and everybody supports one another. We have lots of great projects that are very in depth, that take sometimes a few weeks at a time to complete, and we're learning so much there. So if you're interested in checking it out, there is a link in the description box. And it's basically, if you go to www.patreon.com/Katira Ewing, you will find us. And I hope to see you there. It's $5 a month. You get 3 videos a week. That's 12 videos a month for $5. And it is a lot of work for me. And the reason I started a Patreon is so that I could afford to take the time to make those videos. All right, everybody. Thanks so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And I will hopefully see you again soon. Take care.